they were warned about the consequences for the country of what they were about to do repeatedly, they chose to override it, and afterwards they showed no contrition about what they'd done. I think it would have been acceptable had they done so. But they carried on arguing that dark forces were responsible for it, or tried to blame it on the Bank of England.
Dinner parties.
And that made me extremely cross. And it clearly made their own voters cross. And so it's appropriate that they should be the people that pay the price for that.
It's how to win an election the morning after the election in front of a live audience of Times readers. Yes, here we are. I'm joined, as ever, by new Labour mastermind Peter Mandelson, Polly Mackenzie's Polly Mackenzie, former Director of Policy for Nick Clegg, and Tory brainbox Daniel Finkelstein. We meet, well, it's not how to win an election, how to unpack an election. We know Keir Starmer is going to be Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak has resigned, apologising to the country and to his party. Lib Dems have become the third party in Parliament again, with a record number of seats. The SNP humbled, a good night too for reform and the Greens, so plenty for us to unpack. But first of all, Peter, let's return to what you told us in the middle of the night. A good result for Keir Starmer, but not as good as the result that you and Tony Blair got in 1997.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more.
Well, no, I'm just repeating back to you what you said. You couldn't agree with yourself more.
Actually, it was quite an amazing achievement for this reason, that in 1997, we won after following two elections when we had built up our support. In fact, this time, Keir Starmer has won, having lost very badly in 2019, having lost badly in 2015, following our liberation from public office in 2010. So the Labour Party has been going backwards during the last 10 years, which made Starmer's challenge and task all the greater than ours in 1997.
Yes, in terms of gains, it's actually better than 1997. In terms of raw numbers of seats gained, he has done better.
Don't start getting mathematical.
Policy, policy. I've called you policy. Polly,
you're tired, Matt.
Polly
it's
Mackenzie.
all right.
The Lib Dem records. It's actually even better than when we spoke in the night.
Yeah.
They were falling just short, it seems. But this is a record number of Lib Dem MPs ever.
It's funny, when the Lib Dems had 60-ish under Charles Kennedy, at that point, they were the largest third party anywhere in the world in a first-past-the-post system. And so, I mean, I haven't checked, but it seems to me likely that they are back in that position, which is actually somehow managing to defy all of the logic of first-past-the-post systems, which are supposed to crush small parties. And, you know, it does appear that the Liberal Democrats have achieved this by an amazing kind of efficiency of their vote, because they have 12%, it says on that screen, of the votes and 71 seats. So it's actually proportional.
They've actually ended up with a proportional outcome.
Exactly. Whereas,
does that mean you're never going to talk about PR again?
Well, I'm always going to talk about PR. But you know, there is all sorts of perversities in this system, because I'm glad, from a personal perspective, that Reform have only got 4 seats. But by contrast, you know, they got a substantial number of votes and have got this tiny proportion of seats. Labour have got, 65% of the parliamentary seats on 34% of the votes. Now, that's what happens in first-past-the-post systems. The Liberal Democrats are the ones who are slightly defying the logic of them. And it will completely transform, their parliamentary party, right? Like, in fact, right now, I've seen photographs. They are packing up the Whip's office, because until 2015 we had this really lovely Whip's office just off the kind of voting lobbies, 2-story pigeonholes, you know, nice wood panelling, but after 2015 they got sort of basically relegated to a back office. Anyway, they're packing up, ready to move back,
into the wood
ready
panelling.
To move home.
And Danny, in terms of the Conservatives, there's no way of looking at this on every possible measure. Vote share, seats lost, the number of seats they've got left. This is record-breakingly bad.
Absolutely, in exactly the same way. The reason, on this question of the Liberal Democrats, the reason why that's happened is the Liberal Democrats have joined the two-party system. People who wanted to vote Labour in areas where the Liberal Democrats were the candidates voted for the Liberal Democrats. who, as I've pointed out before, stand for essentially broadly the same thing and are voted for by broadly the same people who just happen to live in different places. And so that it's very important to understand that, to understand the Conservative result. Everyone's going to talk about, Labour didn't do much better. And if you add the Reform vote to the Tory vote, they outperformed Labour. But that misses out the Liberal Democrat vote and the number of seats the Tories lost to the Liberal Democrats, which was vastly more than the number of seats anybody lost to the Reform Party, because the Reform Party got 4 and the Liberal Democrats got 71. So if we talk about where Tory seats have gone, that's where they've gone. And this is a very important part of the future argument about the Conservative Party, because if people miss that out, they're going to think, oh, if you unite the right, you can win. That is not the case. And indeed, I would even question whether some of these people are properly situated on the right. I was sitting next to Neil Kinnock last night when we were talking about the possibility of the Labour Party winning, I think it was Bassett Law, I may have got this wrong, but they had an 86-year-old Labour candidate. And Neil Kinnock goes, oh, I remember him. He used to be in the Revolutionary Communist Party.
The people who have shown absolutely ruthless efficiency, of course, in this whole election are the voters. They knew exactly what they wanted to get out of this election. They wanted to turf the Tories out on their ear. And they have ruthlessly identified and selected any party candidate who is best used in each constituency to achieve that end. So congratulations, the electorate.
Yeah, give yourselves a round of applause.
And that does then ask this question about, has the system failed or succeeded? I would say the primary thing that people were trying to do in this election was remove the government and replace it with a clear alternative government, and the system allows them to do that in a way that other systems would not, and that has to be put alongside the number of seats people want against the proportion. And does it mean that fringe populist parties are somewhat punished by the electorate? Well, it can, and I would regard that as a feature rather than a bug, by the way. But it also needn't necessarily, if reform is more concentrated in certain places, and I think it could end up doing that. It will win more seats, and let's take their vote seriously. There's a certain type of person who has often voted Labour in the past, maybe comes from Labour families in working class areas, who is now attracted to this nationalist message and was previously maybe a unionist with a trade unionist type of Labour family. I think that's obviously very interesting, and for everyone to reflect on how to meet those demands.
Polly, there's been a lot of analysis overnight, people saying this is a wide landslide, but a shallow one. And we are sitting here 5 years after Jeremy Corbyn led Labour to its worst result for 8 years. People saying, oh, this is now a 2-term, a 3-term Keir Starmer government. The truth is, politics is so volatile now that I think in the previous century, only 4 elections saw more than 10% of seats change hands. At the last 4 elections, more than 10% of seats have changed hands. Voters are less tribal. They're more efficient in deciding what they want. And from day one, Keir Starmer cannot take this for granted in the way perhaps Tony Blair might have done in '97. Polly?
I think certainly, what you're saying about people's willingness to change their vote is something that has changed a lot. And you do see people who have probably voted a sort of a Liberal Democrat to UKIP, to Conservative, to Reform voter. That's a pathway that you can see in some of the data that some people, because of a sort of frustration with just the defects of the system and the complexity of government and our horrible kind of centralised way of running the country, which doesn't really work. So that is true, but nevertheless, having a majority of that scale means that you can be relatively relaxed, right? Because it has taken time for the momentum Peter's describing of just everybody wanting rid of the Conservatives. Some people who wanted rid of the Conservatives because Theresa May wasn't very good at organising anything. And there were lots of people who then wanted to get rid of the Conservatives but nowhere near enough kind of critical mass through all of the things that have happened since 2016 in particular, it takes time for people to give up on a government, I think. I think Keir Starmer can go into government with quite a high degree of confidence, actually.
And actually, Peter, it's one thing people wanted to get rid of the Conservatives. We shouldn't underplay what Keir Starmer has done in terms of changing the party, with the phrase he keeps using, but just because it's a cliche doesn't mean it's not true, changing the party and presenting Labour as a mainstream alternative to the party that the country seemed to want to vote out.
Well, I think the reason why that's so important, Matt, is that there have been increasing numbers of voters for increasing number of reasons why people in this country have wanted to see the back of the Conservatives. Take Brexit, for example, whether you voted for or against Brexit. The succeeding years of divisions and indecision and inability to work out how you're going to implement Brexit, I think, really eroded people's faith and confidence in politics. And then when that had been eventually dealt with, along came COVID, not our fault, brought a shock imported into our country, but with a lot of Boris Johnsonian shopping trolley sort of type of decision-making going on, and anyone who has kids in schools knows that they've paid a heck of a price. That's before we got to Partygate. And if all that wasn't bad enough, you had, of course, the calamity of Liz Truss. So you've got banks and banks and banks of voters building up behind a dam, but no alternative Labour Party led by Jeremy Corbyn that people felt was plausible, viable, that they could get behind. And that is what Keir Starmer has changed. He's given people a viable alternative, a proper government to replace the Conservatives at long last.
He's done it relentlessly, I would say, and impressively. But it's hardly a great intellectual innovation. He's just done, and I don't mean that critically, it's plonkingly obvious what you have to do in order to make an opposition party into a government, which is turn it into a responsible, reasonably moderate, fairly cautious, and fit to govern party. That's much easier said than done, but it's not.
It's something the Labour Party's been so good at
yes,
for the last 100 years.
But it's not difficult to conceive of. And you know, the extraordinary thing is that in the Conservative Party there will be not merely a few, but a lot of people who really suggest the Conservative Party go in the opposite direction to that, despite being able to stare at the screen and watch the fact that the forces that did that have got nearly 500 seats in Parliament.
But of course, they have done it without really changing their vote share. And that's one of the things that will be a story on the left, right, that Starmer will have to contend with and is really important. You already see whether it is, you know, those independents who've stood up against, and in some cases won against Labour candidates, Greens, and a range of kind of more left-wing Labour MPs who are saying, but you didn't get as many votes as Jeremy Corbyn. And that proves that it's not a real victory. But that's like, I mean, that's total nonsense, right? Because Jeremy Corbyn lost and Keir Starmer has won. And saying that if it was a different game with different rules, Jeremy Corbyn would have won, it's like, well,
it's not stopping them.
You can't play badminton at Wimbledon, right? Like, it just, that's not how it works. So, but people will... The point is, the game in our first-past-the-post system is the game that Keir Starmer has played. And so instead of just trying to get more votes, he's tried to get different votes, namely the votes in the constituents they needed in order to win. Liberal Democrats have also done that ruthlessly as well. You know, seat after seat, those early seats where the Liberal Democrats are getting sort of, 500 votes, maybe 1,000 votes, and you're like, oh my God, does anybody vote Liberal Democrat? And then suddenly you'll see a 30% swing or something in one of the seats they've targeted. That is
because
the game.
The voters are so efficient.
But exactly. But the point is that that's the game. That is how our electoral system works. And if you want to thrive in politics, you have to play that game and not a different one. And both on left and right, people will need to understand that it's not just a simple question of how many votes can you get.
Well, up next, we'll ask the question, can the Conservatives do the plonkingly obvious when it comes to getting, or there's definitely a joke in there about plonkers, which I'm too tired to try.
Can we also talk about ties?
Ties?
Yeah.
What about them?
Well, I have thoughts after last night.
I spent all night wearing a bow tie.
I know.
It was very hot.
That's what I want to talk about.
Bow tie and a velvet jacket in a studio for 8 hours. It was very
It
warm.
was so awful.
But you weren't there.
I saw you when we were doing the podcast at 11 o'clock. I thought, what a...
But Peter,
Right, there's the plonker joke we were looking for. Right, our conversation will continue next on Times Radio. We are just watching now pictures of Rishi Sunak leaving Buckingham Palace. So he's handed in his notice. He's collected his P45 and will be heading off back to Richmond in Yorkshire, where he did say actually he will remain as their MP for the coming weeks, months, and years. Is what he said. Danny, let's go back to what you were talking about, the plonkingly obvious way that you go from being in opposition to being in government. Who is the plonker for that job?
So look, the first thing I think the Conservative Party needs to think about is what is the correct approach. And there's no doubt that some people who have voted Conservative in the past have now voted for reform, as well as having given Liberal Democrats lots of seats, making the problem a bit trickier, certainly when you look at it. My view is that both people who voted for reform and people who voted Liberal Democrat and Labour were doing it as a kind of party, as a protest against the Conservative Party failing to deliver on things. And so turning the Conservative Party into a serious party attracts voters from all sorts of different backgrounds, and that's the right thing for the Conservative Party to do. Whether it has, in Parliament now, got somebody who is willing to pitch themselves in this way, because I really can only see, I may be missing somebody, but I can see 3 people who might run for the leadership. There's James Cleverly, Camille Badenoch, and there is Tom Tugendhat. And of those 3, it seems to me most likely that Camille Badenoch will win. And Camille is a very intelligent person and could pitch herself as somebody who wants to be moderate Prime Minister, but she's also could pitch herself as a battler against woke ideas or whatever the thought is, and I think that would be the wrong route for her to go. So I don't think it's obvious the Conservative Party has in Parliament its next Prime Minister, but it certainly has the capacity to move quite rapidly. Given the result, there's the capacity for the Conservative Party to move quite rapidly. It doesn't need to spend 10, 15 years working this out. It could work it out more quickly.
I don't know if it's deliberate or accidental, but you seem to have forgotten Suella Braverman.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I had, because I think that's untenable. I don't think that'll happen, but it's also, in my view, completely untenable proposition, and it wouldn't obviously fit with what the Conservative Party should be trying to do. Obviously, the Conservative Party has to be respectful to all sorts of voters, and there's no point in me saying, well, we should be respectful to Liberal Democrat voters, but not to Reform voters. At the same time, it's worthwhile noting that the Conservative Party has won elections in the past when it hasn't won Bassett Law and Hartlepool, and it has never won elections when it hasn't won Cambridgeshire and Surrey Heath. And there are more of those seats. So the Conservative Party has to decide what it wants its coalition to be. In my view, if it aligns itself, what it did a little bit last time was align itself with people who wanted things the Conservative Party could never produce, not only because it didn't want to, because the Conservative Party is sort of instinctively a small government, more business-orientated party, trying to cater to people who wanted more investment in welfare and in their areas, and there was a tension between those things, and partly because the Conservative Party partly because it didn't want to, and partly because it's very difficult for any government to address the problems that those people have. So I think going after those seats and trying to be the challenger in those areas, and still trying to hold on in the south is going to be a very difficult thing, and that's not how I'd approach it. But whoever's the leader will have to decide.
So, what, Danny, should they do about Reform UK?
My view is that if you create a political party that is, so in this election, Richard Bergen got in with an increased majority, and he's a left-wing campaign member, right? Because Keir Starmer lifted the whole party. You create a fit-to-govern party with real solutions to the problems, the actual problems that people face. You look as though you're a government that will behave with competence, integrity, responsibility, that's concerned about the electorate.
So he
rather
lifts
than
all
itself.
Labour votes.
And I believe that you can win votes from everyone if you do that. And the other thing that will happen is everyone thinks the Conservative Party is going to split about its relationship with reform. I think there's a bigger chance reform splits over that. So we're assuming that reform will be a force in 5 years. But something disastrous happened to Nigel Farage last night, which was 3 other people got elected to Parliament as well as him. Now he's started this thing of turning this company that he's got into a democratic political movement. Fiasco. Obviously, there was a reason why they created it it was a little bit of historical anomaly, but the other reason they created it as a company was so that nobody else could decide what to do. And I'm just noticing that every time Nigel Farage has run a political party, he's done 2 things, done extremely well, is an incredibly compelling public personality, and also fallen out with everybody.
Which is what happened the last time his party had MPs. He fell out with Douglas Carr's when he only had one of them.
Exactly. When I did football probabilities, the first thing you say is, what's going to happen next time? You start with what happened last time. That's what happened last time, is all I'm saying.
Polly, there's also an interesting thing that Caroline Lucas, who's the Green MP, who's just stood down. I did an exit interview with her, because I spoke to lots of MPs who were standing down. And she sort of talked about how she felt she had more impact when she wasn't an MP, when she was the charismatic Green campaigner, because otherwise you sort of end up in the House of Commons, you've got all the constituency stuff, how often you're allowed to speak, how often you're allowed to go on the tellies, all now decided by ratios and all that sort of thing. That actually Nigel Farage could, he's now the leader of a party with only 4 MPs.
Though, I don't know Caroline Lucas well, but she seems to be a person who takes her sort of duties and responsibilities seriously. And that might be the contrast with Nigel Farage, right?
No, he said he's going to work very hard for Clacton.
He said he's going to bring in some foreign direct investment, I think he said, which sounds, a little risky to me, given who some of his friends are. But good luck to Clacton. He's also going to get more tourists to go there, mostly journalists, I expect, to collecting vox pops. But, Nigel Farage never let his duties and responsibilities as a member of the European Parliament get in the way of self-aggrandizement. So I think, actually, there's one of those considerations for the media to have, is that Reform have 4 MPs, the Greens have 4 MPs. Now, yes, on different vote shares, but nevertheless, they ought to be getting relatively equal status and positioning on things like Question Time or, shows that people actually watch. And just because Nigel Farage has a bit more kind of charisma, say, than Carla Denyer.
One leader. Yeah. If you want the public to know who a leader is, it'd be better if the Green Party could decide.
Well, yes, maybe that would help, but also maybe she should, go to Chessington World of Adventures and, do some Ed Davies style stunts. I don't know, but nevertheless.
Apparently, that's all my fault.
And of course, there are also 4 independents as well, all of whom actually have, as Mita was referring to earlier, sort of relatively consistent worldview actually, and have used kind of campaigning around Gaza in particular to secure their individual seats.
Just briefly, Peter, because you've been there in the dark times of the Labour Party, what would your advice to the Tory party be?
They've got to decide what they are going to do about Reform UK. And nobody's answered this question. Do they fight Reform UK and see them off? Or do they become Reform UK? You can't do both. It's either or. And it seems to me that they've got to take a decision, and they're split 50-50. You've seen it during this election campaign. Swallow Braverman keeps saying, let's embrace them. There's very little that divides
The
us.
banter option, of course, is for them to just split in half if they're 50-50. Half of them join the Lib Dems, become the official opposition, and the other half can be the rump reformers.
You're missing, both of you, this thing, which is everyone's talking about how does the Tory party deal with reform because reform split the Conservative Party vote. Let's look at this another way. The other thing is that reform have got a problem of how do they deal with the Conservative Party, since the Conservative Party split the reform vote, right? So why is it the case that people are arguing that Conservative Party should move towards reform and not that the Reform Party should move
Because the
towards...
Conservatives
I'm
have
not
considered
really.
themselves the natural party of
what
government for
the
200
reason I'm
years.
putting it that way is a thought experiment. Okay, I obviously understand the answer.
But Danny, the risk is that the Reform UK hoover up the Tory party.
I think that we've just had an election in which the Reform Party ended up only getting 15% of the vote.
That's true, but we
And
know that there is about half the Tory party who see themselves essentially as Reform UK type Conservatives. They won't mind if Farage sort of reverse engineers himself
That's
into the
certainly the
Conservative
case
Party.
for some of them, although, interestingly, I think it's not at all 50-50. I don't think there's anywhere close to 50% of the Conservative Party who thinks Nigel Farage ought to be a member of the
At the
Conservative
grassroots?
I really don't. No, I really genuinely don't think that. But I think that, and certainly not in Parliament. And
But we
even
don't
among
So
really-
it's just Suella Braverman
people
who thinks
like Boris Johnson, for example. So, but the reason why I put it in the way that I did, an obvious absurdity, how does the Reform Party deal with is that they cannot get elected more broadly unless they win the centre any more than anybody else can. Ultimately, though the Reform Party is like all right-wing Conservative parties, Conservatives have been for years, or right-wing people of any group, or trade unionists in the Labour Party, which is also part of their tradition. They also need the centre in order to govern in our political system, and they haven't got it. So they've also got a problem. They're going to hit up against a limit in which they've got 4 seats and 15% in this unbelievable momentum election campaign. What are they going to do?
I'm conscious we haven't discussed ties, Polly, but we'll do that. We'll clear the next half an hour and we'll just do ties. We'll come to some of your questions in a moment. We need to address this important issue of national and possibly international importance. Polly, why do we need to talk about ties?
Well, just because the tie Peter was wearing last night on the television was a real eye bleeder. And we have, on this podcast, talked extensively about Peter's incredible, not just sartorial taste for himself, but amazing political judgment and skill at picking ties for Gordon Brown, for Tony Blair, transforming their political
ties in politics.
Exactly, and
So
then
much.
last
You
night,
think I've now let myself down?
I turned on BBC. Am I allowed to mention it? And I felt dizzy just looking at you.
So I spent quite a lot of time thinking about what tie to wear, because I realised that if you wear a red tie, people start commenting, I can't believe you're wearing a red tie. They think it signifies something. And I remember before the 97 general election, John Major picking me up on the fact that I was wearing a red tie, and I couldn't believe it, that he cared about it, but he actually obviously seemed to do so.
There's a great pair of Lib Dem socks over there.
But so in the end, I didn't wear a tie at all, and I wondered as a result whether, and it wasn't necessary, I wondered whether really the ties had it.
Well, if any of you are in any doubt whatsoever, go to your app, your How to Win an Election app. I was wearing the same tie last night as I have worn in the podcast from the beginning.
Really?
Look at
Maybe it's the television.
Maybe
I don't know. It was just...
adds power.
You know your instinct that this was an asinine question that didn't need to be answered.
No, this is. It's your grey one. It's a sort of grey knitted thing
sort
with
of-
coloured spots.
It's my Ukraine solidarity.
Oh, right, don't
It
try.
has blue and yellow spots, and I wear it for Ukraine, and I will not take it off until Ukraine is free.
And that's how he became known as the Prince of Darkness and the Dark Arts. To spin, to get a round of applause out of wearing a bad tie. Which demonstrates extraordinary skill. Right, let's do some questions. I think that's probably enough ties. Let's do some questions.
Matt is so cynical.
Right, let's take some questions from the room here at the top of Times Radio Taz. James Humpish, your question, please.
Hi, everyone. Last night, who was the Portillo moment, in your opinion? Was it someone like Liz Truss representing the downfall of the Tories, or was it, with Labour's new tenuous ground, someone like Jonathan Ashworth?
Yes, Jonathan Ashworth is interesting. He was a key part of Keir Starmer's election campaign team. He was on the morning rounds an awful lot, and he lost his seat in Leicester, which is probably the most unexpected, because you think if the Labour Party is winning a landslide, losing one of your front benches seems a little careless. And yet Liz Truss I mean, partly for me, it probably is the Portillo moment because I missed it, because I had an hour's worth of sleep. What?
I said it would be.
You did on the podcast on Tuesday.
Yeah. And it occurred to me suddenly when you asked, we were asked to think about a constituency we'd be watching on the evening, and it occurred to me that would be the one to watch. If the message was people didn't want to vote Conservative, that would be the symbol of it. And I wondered who would be prepared to return her to Parliament over what had happened. And so that definitely was at the Portillo moment. So the John Ashworth was more the Patrick Gordon-Walker moment. So Patrick Gordon-Walker was going to be Wilson.
I mean, you don't need to tell us, Daddy, but go on.
Was going to be Wilson's Foreign Secretary in 1964, but he lost his seat. And he then said about fought a by-election in Leighton and lost that as well. So they had to then appointed Michael Stewart to be Foreign Secretary instead of him. So he actually became Foreign Secretary even though he didn't have a seat. But the Liz Truss was that because it was a deeper result than the others. It's pretty shocking for the former Prime Minister. And then I think the thing about the Portillo moment, which is important, is that there was also an element in people thinking, well, now we're really delivering to the Conservatives what we mean to say. And when Portillo lost his seat, that's what it felt like. The only thing that was missing is that Portillo was potentially the next leader of the Conservative Party at that point. And he wasn't, because later he became more of a moderniser and then would have probably been my candidate. At that point, he wasn't. And I was standing, I think I've said this on the podcast before, I was standing next to William Hague when that came up on the television screen in Central Office. And I could see in William's face, and both of us knew that meant that it was very likely that he'd be the next leader of the Conservative Party. So quite a big moment in William's life and also in mine.
In fact, William was on the overnight show on Times Radio, and I asked him what would be your advice to someone about to throw their hat into the ring to become a Tory leader. He took a deep breath and said, "Don't do it." Peter,
Jonathan Ashworth was not or is not going to become the next leader or Prime Minister, but he's a very, very talented and able young politician. I've known him for a very long time. We worked in Number 10 together when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. He's played a really, really sterling part in this campaign, along with Pat McFadden and Eddie Reeves, Rachel's sister, and Morgan McSweeney. And I have absolutely no doubt that Jonathan Ashworth will be back.
As an MP or in the Lords?
I'm sure if he wants to be an MP, he'll be back as an MP.
Yeah. I wouldn't, if I were
I don't think he's too
him,
young to go to the Lords.
I wouldn't say that he should join the Lords. He can return to Parliament I think he should try and do it soon before Labour starts losing by-elections, because which obviously will happen. Look,
he lost narrowly, but let's be clear, he was a casualty of the Gaza war. And this has been quite an interesting subplot in this whole election campaign. What you have seen is a number of Labour candidates, including Keir Starmer, by the way, targeted very, very finely by a nationally orchestrated, I wonder whether Iran-funded, largely TikTok and social media campaign. But on the street, it's been very aggressive. There have been Labour candidates and Labour campaign workers who have faced raw violence on the street, bullying, intimidation, not only towards them, but towards voters. It has been an assault not only on their political opponents, in my view, but on British democracy itself.
And we saw that at some of the counts. Rochdale was Paul Wall, one beating George Galloway. There was
Jez Phillips was shouted
Jez Phillips
down.
in Birmingham as well. Polly, what was your Portillo moment?
It's funny, isn't it? There is a sort of Schadenfreude joy, I guess, that comes from seeing someone like Liz Truss receive the judgment of the voters. But in some ways, Jeremy Hunt did in fact hold on to his seat, but it was very interesting that actually his speech was proper statesman-like stuff, which made me feel much more kind of connected to the humanity of all of these losses, actually. And most of, not all, Liz Truss didn't quite pull it off, but most of those who we saw lose did so with an amount of dignity and grace about it. Grant Shapps, my first response probably was sort of, I don't know, hilarity really. at dear old Grant Shapps / Michael Green, or
Whatever his name is today.
whatever his name is today. And yeah, actually, you know, when you are sort of dead as a politician, you are so dead. And it is such a sudden stop.
Thank you.
And you're the undead, Peter.
You've come back from the dead several times, Peter.
But it is that sense of a career interrupted, and where somebody has themselves been responsible for and led kind of disastrous government. That's one thing, but actually there are MPs who are kind of swept along with a tide. And Portillo himself, I think, was somebody who sort of swept along with a tide. But it is astonishing, again, the number of cabinet ministers and the number of ministers who have lost their seats. That there isn't a single kind of iconic moment. There's just dozens of them.
And actually, the clear out of Team Truss is also striking. One of the things that Kwasi Kwarteng stood down already, so he's not an MP. But Therese Coffey, Simon Clarke, Ranald Jayawadena, lots of people who are in her closest team all went.
Can I say that if anybody is going to pay the price for the Conservative Party's defeat, and I don't like to see any human being lose their seat, John Ashworth or anyone else, then it's correct that it should be those people, because...
And I imagine it's much easier if you're
they
the candidate
were
against them.
because they were warned about the consequences for the country of what they were about to do repeatedly. They chose to override it, and afterwards they showed no contrition about what they'd done. I think it would have been acceptable had they done so. But they carried on arguing that dark forces were responsible for it, or tried to blame it on the Bank of England.
Dinner parties.
And that made me extremely cross. And it clearly made their own voters cross. And so it's appropriate that they should be the people that pay the price for that.
Paul got in touch on the WhatsApp saying, for some reason I can't find the answer to this on Google, so can you help? Is Liz Truss the first former Prime Minister to lose their seat in the subsequent general election? I know the answer to that. It's not. Arthur Balfour in 1906, which was previously the worst result of the Conservative Party. He'd only stood down as Prime Minister a month or so before, handed over the keys to the government to the Liberals. They called it an election. He lost his seat in that, so no, he isn't. There we are. Paul.
I was going to tell you that. It's very unfair of you to agree.
Well, no, I've been reading a bit briefly on this, Daddy. It's, my in-depth knowledge of 1906 is only going to be useful for the rest of today. Let's take a question from in the room now. Janet.
Morning, everybody. Following the results of the general election and many seats changing hands across the board and some surprising results, is there any such thing in the future as a safe seat?
Is there such a thing as a safe seat, Polly?
I think there's 121 of them, right?
It's the Conservative figure.
Which is the Conservative figure. Because actually, if you think about the confluence of circumstances from the enormous promise of Brexit, which delivered nothing, the complete mess of delivering it, Boris Johnson breaking all sorts of laws, both in order to get Brexit done and then the laws he imposed during COVID, economic shock after economic shock, Liz Truss, an absolutely batshit chaotic, completely incompetent campaign involving rain and Titanic and stuff. If you can hold your seat in those circumstances, that's pretty safe, I would say. But it's just way smaller than I think the Conservatives would have thought it was.
I think the Conservative Party, those could still be lost if the Conservative Party doesn't do the right thing now. And the Conservative Party's got itself in a position where it doesn't know whether its coalition is to be reformed out of the seats it lost to the Liberal Democrats or out of the votes it lost to Reform, and I'm not sure it's going to do what it ought to, which is to find a way through that. And I think there is a way through it. So you could lose those seats. So I think it's a very thoughtful question, if I may say. I hadn't really thought about it in the way that you put it, but you're right. That's a feature of this election as it's become more efficient. And last time someone like Ed Balls losing his seat, and Ed Miliband coming close to losing his seat, Yvette coming close to losing her seat. So it's certainly. I think it's a good thing if no member of Parliament thinks I'm definitely going to win my seat and I can do what I like. And one of the aspects of the Liz Truss defeat is that you simply cannot go to see Steve Bannon and talk about the deep state and pretend that you didn't nearly crash the economy. And you can't do that and still win your seat, even if you've been former Prime Minister and even if you've got one of the safest seats in the country. And thank goodness we live in a country in which that is the case.
I'd go a step further.
Just while we're talking, people are making their way up Downing Street with umbrellas. So Keir Starmer came on the show this week, and I asked him, because I'd seen the forecast, it wasn't looking good, and he said he was a man with a plan, and he owned an umbrella. There are people walking up Downing Street, some with black umbrellas, some with Union Jack umbrellas, Peter. Would you advise that? Is that patriotic?
Yes, and why
Somebody's-
shouldn't they if they
yeah.
want to? But the point I was going to make in answer to the question was that Keir Starmer and all his colleagues in the government should assume that all their votes are simply lent to them. And what the electorate giveth, the electorate can take away. And therefore, everything they do in government should be predicated on that assumption, that knowledge that if they don't go right, if they don't think things through thoroughly, if they lose their way, if they don't communicate properly, if they don't have the best people giving them the best advice, if they don't not just take those early first steps in what they need to do, but think ahead and start changing things for the long term, the public will take their votes back and give them elsewhere. And that's what they've got to bear in mind in their heads every day they wake up, every day of this government.
Yeah, I think it's important not, though, to do that by looking at who's won a couple of seats and then giving in to whatever they've demanded. That what people are after is actually delivering things that they want, and that isn't necessarily done by following their advice about how to do it. You have to follow your own instinct about how best to achieve it and achieve results.
Okay, we'll do some more questions in just a moment. The Brollies are out in Downing Street, and this is a question from Sarah Mayman.
Hi. So now that Starmer's in power and Labour are in power, what will be their first U-turn and when will it happen?
There we are, Peter. Let's get down to it.
First of all, you have to decide the direction of travel before you have your U-turn. And I'm going to sidestep your question by saying that the first thing they need to do is to define the mandate on which they're operating. Because I think that in the fog of this election campaign and this great battle that has ensued, people either didn't notice the manifesto or noticed it and didn't read it, or read it and have promptly forgotten it. And I think what the government needs to do is to define very clearly for the public what they are going to do, how, over what sort of timeline, in order to frame people's expectations of what the government can do and in what time. I think one of the dangers of having such a large majority is that everyone thinks that everything can be done so much more easily and quickly. It doesn't change the arithmetic, doesn't change the economic facts of life, it doesn't change the state of the National Health Service and how long it's going to take to rebuild it and then reform it. So my way of not answering your question is to say, first of all, they've got to be much clearer and much more defined in what they are actually going to do as a government.
Sort of setting out that shop, but it's actually the way the coalition that you were part of, Polly, did literally lay out in black and white exactly what you plan to do over the next 5 years as a sort of checklist that everyone could hold you to.
Yes, a programme for government. But that was because we had two manifestos. So we had to, it'd be a bit weird to do a second manifesto after you elected. Like, here's the real one. But there obviously are sort of operating plans and detailed work that will have been done both on their own and in partnership with the civil service. I think I want to predict something that I really don't want to happen in hopes that my track record on predictions, which is rubbish, helps to stop it from happening, which is that they've actually been really bold about house building, including kind of redefining what Greenbelt is for and challenging the kind of NIMBY culture that has built up, particularly around the southeast. And you now will have a wall of Lib Demish NIMBYs, and I'm afraid it's the thing I like least about the Lib Dems is a tendency towards that, plus another wall of Toryish NIMBYs all across the southeast. And will Labour have the confidence to address that? Because there are, again, in all of these seats which need building, there are a smattering of kind of Labour MPs now around as well. What will the political dynamics of that evolve? I think it is so brave and so fantastic. And not because I hate the environment, right? But Greenbelt is an urban development policy, not an environmental policy. And you could green the Greenbelt by building on 10% of it and using the resources to invest in actually making it accessible and high quality and biodiverse. So it's not about abolishing protection for the environment. I'm really scared that they won't do what they've promised.
Danny.
Well, I think we shouldn't be very worried about U-turns. And one of the joys about them they're now being a Labour government is when I say that, and people don't think I'm just covering up for the Tories. So there are certain things that I believe that we should let governments do much more than we do. Another being waiting 3 or 4 days before you decide whether someone needs to be fired, like you would do in any organisation. This is one of them. So I think they're going to face problem with the promises they've made on tax when they face the budgets for the first couple of years, and it would be better to U-turn on that than it would be to not be able to deliver the things that you want to be able to deliver on public services. I also think they're going to face a fight with the doctors over the junior doctor strike. They've implied that they would settle it. I hope that actually Wes Streeting realises that is a battle he needs to be robust about, otherwise he's going to get himself pushed around by health interests the whole time. So I think one of the things that we ought to do is, as long as people are moving their policy from a bad idea towards a good one, we should not be so worried about, everyone will obviously have their own idea about it, but from an unworkable idea to a more workable one, we should let them do that and not be so concerned about whether it's a U-turn. And also, I think Keir Starmer will be particularly susceptible to it. He'll have an instinct. Throughout his whole life, he's been a left liberal. I have a left liberal instinct, and then often reality won't accord with that. And one of his impressive attributes is that he then thinks that through and changes his mind, and I'm willing to give him the space to do that.
Well, we'll see how he gets on. Keir Starmer on his way to meet the King. While we've just been speaking, it's stopped raining. They've put away the umbrellas. It's actually slightly brightening up, even here at the top of Times Radio Towers. There's a metaphor there, Peter.
Well, he literally said it in his speech.
Yes.
It was pale at first and then growing stronger.
It's talking about Peter.
Something. Sunlight. Marching into the sunlight. I thought he was going to sort of launch into You'll Never Walk Alone or something.
Yeah. Well, there we are. The sun is shining as he arrives at Buckingham Palace. Thank you so much for getting up or staying up or whatever it is that you did to come in to Times Radio Towers. Please show your appreciation for the panel. Peter Mandelson, Polly Mackenzie and Daniel Finkelstein. They'll be back next week. We'll carry on with How to Win an Election, at least in the next few weeks while I'm still here. If you want to get in touch, you can email howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. How to Win an Election, wherever you get your podcasts from.